Wordsworth's 1806 poem, Elegiac Stanzas, marks a shift, a fairly abrupt shift in his thinking about the relationship between mind and nature. It has a very direct biographical source. In 1805, his brother, John Wordsworth, a sea captain, was in a shipwreck and died. Wordsworth was devastated, as was his sister Dorothy. They were very close to John. They loved him deeply. So this tragedy really shook Wordsworth to the core. So this poem is, among other things, an elegy for his brother John, even though he doesn't mention the accident in the poem. It's obvious that he has his brother in mind because the poem's about shipwreck. I'm going to talk about a few stanzas in the poem to show you how this poem marks a shift in Wordsworth's thinking about the relationship between mind and nature. Before I do, though, a little more biographical context. So Peel Castle, the subtitle of the book is, or the poem, Elegiac Stanzas, subtitle, suggested by a picture of Peel Castle in a storm painted by Sir George Beaumont. So Wordsworth had been to Peel Castle. It was on the southern coast of the Lake District where he spent much of his life. So he knew that castle. He knew the seascape beyond that castle. In 1806, after his brother died, he actually saw this painting by Beaumont at the Royal Academy in London. So he had this picture in mind, and he uses this picture as a starting point for thinking about brightness in nature and grimness in nature. So he says, he addresses the castle. He says, "I was thy neighbor once. I lived near you, and the day I visited you, Peel Castle, it was beautiful. The sky was pure, the air was quiet. It was so very like this day to day. And whenever I looked, your image was still there. It trembled but never passed away." So the castle suggests a kind of stability in the midst of this lovely oceanic landscape, which suggests only calm to the younger Wordsworth. Notice he's using past tense. How perfect was the calm! It seemed no sleep, no mood which season takes away or brings. I could have fancied that the mighty deep was even the gentlest of all gentle things. Ah, then, if mine had been the painter's hand, if I'd been Beaumont, to express what then I saw, and add the gleam, the light that never was, on land, on sea or land, the consecration and the poet's dream. I would have planted thee, thou hoary pile, still talking to the castle, amid a world how different from this, beyond a sea that could not cease to smile, on tranquil land, beneath a sky of bliss. Thou shouldst have seemed a treasure house, a mine of peaceful years, a chronicle of heaven. Of all the sunbeams that did ever shine, the very sweetest had to thee been given. So the painting shows a rough sea and a ship struggling in the sea. And Wordsworth says, if I, based on my past experience of Peel Castle and the harmonious oceanscape near it, if I were Beaumont, I would have painted a more peaceful landscape. Now, notice two things. He says, in looking at this castle when I visited there many years ago, I could have fancied that the mighty deep was even the gentlest of all gentle things. Notice the word fancy. It's somewhat synonymous with imagination, but not really. For someone like Wordsworth, who has valued imagination so much, for him not to use imagination here, for him not to say, I could have imagined that the mighty deep was even the gentlest of all gentle things, is certainly significant. So imagination and fancy both suggest that the mind makes up things that aren't necessarily empirically real. But fancy has to do with whim and fantasy, kind of flimsy, fleeting, maybe overly optimistic visions. So there's a suggestion here that the mind of the poet is not one ruled by imagination, but by, again, whim and fantasy. And he says, you know what I would have painted? The light that never was on sea or land, the consecration and the poet's dream. The light that never was. So he's already acknowledging here that the light that he imagines does not really exist. It could be a product of fancy. He could be making up the light. It never was on land or sea. It was only a poet's dream. So remember that light that Wordsworth is searching for in the Intimations Ode? He believes that everything when he was young was apparelled in celestial light, seemed apparelled in celestial light. Of course, we talk about the ambiguity of that verb seem, and we talked about the ambiguity of the verb apparel. But there's a real sense that he yearns for a light as a poet, and he thinks that he might be able to remember it, grasp it, channel it, even if that's very difficult and perhaps impossible. But here there's a sense that the light, it doesn't exist. It's an ideal. So as he's distancing himself from the kind of language he was using back in the Intimations, which of course wasn't really. It was still in the works when this poem was written. It was first published in 1807, written 1802 to 1804, the Intimations Ode. So Wordsworth still kind of working with like two opposing systems of ideas. So he goes on to say, such in the fond delusion of my heart, such a picture would I have at that time made. In the delusion of my heart, overwhelmed by fancy, believing in a light that doesn't really exist, I would have created a peaceful seascape around Peel Castle. And seen the soul of truth in every part, a faith, a trust that could not be betrayed. So I would have believed that this is real and this light is real. Back then, I would have deluded myself into thinking that. So once it might have been. And then this dash, that really is a hard dividing line, this dash on line 33, that really breaks from the past to the present. So once it would have been, 'tis no more. I have submitted to a new control. The power is gone, which nothing can restore. A deep distress hath humanized my soul. So the old way of coloring experience with the imagination, the old way of trying to channel the light of childhood, the old way of imagining the world potentially apparelled in celestial light, gone. 'Tis no more. We don't know why, but that break, it's like the break, it's like the poem itself almost cracks in two. It's like the poem is a ship cracking on a reef or something like that. 'Tis so no more. I've committed to a new control. What's that new control? It's certainly not fancy. It doesn't suggest imagination. A power is gone. The power of imagination, the power of shaping the world to fit your desires through the power of your mind, and nothing can restore it. A deep distress hath humanized my soul. So this is interesting, that even though he seems to have lost that old power of imagination that we saw so prominently in Tintern Abbey and Intimations, the suffering has humanized him. What does that mean? Has he become more sympathetic toward the suffering of others? Has he become more morally alert? Has he become more interested in goodness than in beauty? Probably all that. So he continues discussing what this humanization is until we get to the very end of the poem, the last two stanzas, which I'll read. Farewell, the heart that lives alone, housed in a dream, at distance from the kind. Such happiness, wherever it be known, is to be pitied, for 'tis surely blind. That old happiness, that old ability to use the imagination to enter into the natural world as a realm of power and light, that was blind. Welcome what? Fortitude and patient cheer and frequent sights of what is to be born. Such sights or worse as are before me here. Not without hope we suffer and mourn. So there it is. I don't want to be the solitary poet in the natural world, trying to commune with the natural world through my imagination. That's the world of dream. That's the world of blindness. That's the world of fancy and fantasy. The world is dark and horrible. It kills brothers. It randomly wrecks ships. That's what the world's like. So instead of trying to imagine that world as beautiful or imagine a world outside of this that's beautiful, it's best just to face the world for what it is. And what do? You have to have fortitude. You have to be patient. You have to acknowledge that we suffer. You have to acknowledge that we mourn. And out of that, you have to try to conjure some kind of hope. So someone said that Wordsworth here takes a kind of ethical turn, that he starts writing poems that are less about the individual poet trying to commune with nature and more about a kind of social sensibility of how we should comport ourselves in a dark world of trouble in which we seek good and try to act in a morally correct way. Soon after this, he has a poem, for instance, called "Ode to Duty." Um, so I'm not saying that this is a clean break necessarily. I said that early in my lecture, but I mean, it's obviously Wordsworth didn't suddenly say, I'm not going to be a solitary poet in nature anymore with this poem. He still did that and still wrote poems in that regard. But certainly there's a kind of ethical seriousness in Wordsworth around this time, 1806. And it grows partially out of his mourning over the death of his brother John, the sea